I want to bring my panel in, an extraordinary one, Jon Meacham, a presidential historian and the biographer of George H.W. Bush, and an MSNBC contributor. Peter Wehner, a senior fellow at the Ethics Public Policy Center who also worked in both Bush administrations. Kenneth Blackwell, Ohio Secretary of State and served as HUD Undersecretary under Bush 41. Evan Siegfried, a GOP strategist and Lauren Leader, the co-founder and CEO of All In Together. Jon, you know I must start with you. In your mind, what is the most important part of Bush's legacy?
That he was president at a pivotal moment when Armageddon, before he was president, was a possibility. After him, it was unthinkable. And he did it based on the ancient Greek principle that character is destiny. He was a man of great privilege, but who absolutely believed, embodied, breathed the idea that to whom much is given, much was expected. He understood that life had been very fortunate for him, and so he was going to do his damnedest to try to extend his hand to others. It's a moment, I think, for us to reflect not just on a bygone era, but it's also important that George Bush would be the first person to tell you that he wasn't perfect, and that if he was an imperfect guy, as he would put it, and could do good things, then the rest of us who are so imperfect can do the same thing. And I think that is a compelling part of the legacy that we're going to be contemplating this week.
And a true family man. Peter, you worked in both the Bush 41 White House and Bush 43. These two men, a father and son duo, had very different reputations and leadership styles. Tell us about the differences you saw in this father and son and the relationship they had.
Well, his son, I think, had a more vivid personality and was more Texas in a way, as opposed to his father, who was WASP. But the differences were overwhelmingly set aside compared to something else, which is the remarkable love that they had for each other. And it's been said a lot how much George H.W. Bush loved his family. But what struck me, because I was closer to his son, was not only how much they loved him, but they revered him. To a person, they said he was the greatest person that they knew. And one of the things that strikes me about President Bush 41 is that those who knew him best loved him most. So he was a person of tremendous decency. He also showed that qualities like gentleness and kindness were actually virtues and strengths, not bluster, not bullying. This is a man who was a fascinating combination of qualities and characteristics. And one other thing to what Jon Meacham said, who knows President Bush better than anybody in a sense because of the biography, is it was a quality of prudence. Dana Carvey in 1992 used to make jokes on Saturday Night Live. Prudence is a great virtue. It's a great conservative virtue. It's a great virtue to have in a president, and it was extremely important to have at that period of time that George H.W. Bush was president.
Evan, President Clinton read the letter. It's extraordinary. We've been talking about it all weekend that he received from Bush after Clinton defeated him in the '93 election. And I want to play a bit of it last night when President Clinton read it on 60 Minutes.
There will be very tough times, made even more difficult by criticism you may not think is fair. I'm not a very good one to give advice, but just don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. You will be our president when you read this note. I wish you well. I wish your family well. Your success now is our country's success. I'm rooting hard for you. Good luck.
I'm rooting hard for you, and he meant it. What can we learn at this time, at this moment in history, about grace and civility? All the time, right here in this newsroom, we talk about the need for decency. That's exactly what this man was.
Grace and civility are strength, and George Bush embodied that. You know, my grandmother actually grew up with him, and she was telling me this morning about how they would go to church together at St. Anne's Chapel just at Kennebunkport. And George Bush was the one who took around the collection plate every Sunday morning. And all the other kids, she said, thought he was too angelic and that he probably dipped his hand in the collection plate. But they only realized when he became a man that that was the essence of George Bush. And they were wrong as kids, and they were gladly wrong. And we saw it then. We saw it in how he dealt with the passing of Robin from leukemia. Remember, in 2013, one of his Secret Service detail's sons was 2 years old and got leukemia himself. All of Bush's Secret Service detail shaved their head in solidarity, and so did George Bush, because he understood what that was like and how you go through it. And when Barbara Bush, who was nobody to be reserved, was asked about it, she said, damn right, it's really good that he did that, and brought attention to this. And I think leukemia donations surged as a result of George Bush. There was a grace there from his foreign policy. He oversaw tectonic shifts in the global order. The fall of the Soviet Union, when the Berlin Wall came down, he could have spiked the football and said, this is a rah-rah moment for America, but he didn't. He didn't do anything. The whole point being, because it would make it harder on Gorbachev and make it harder for us to partner up. And lastly, what George Bush recognized about America, which makes him, to me, the last gentleman in Washington, was that our political opponents aren't opponents at all. They're friends with whom we differ. And that is what we need to remember. And I think a lot of younger Republicans have remembered that for a while and missed that.
Ken, you worked closely with President Bush. Tell us about your experience with him, President Bush as a leader. We're talking about how he reached across the aisle. And really, that letter to Bill Clinton is stunning, especially if you put it in today's context.
That was the essence of President Bush. You know, it's fascinating that we talk about mothers and fathers and grandmothers. You know, my grandmother once said that you could judge a person by how they dealt with 3 books, and they were his or her date book, checkbook, and the good book. And George Bush, you know, really, in fact, every time he came to a point where he had to choose between the path of convenience and the path of conviction. He, in fact, chose the path of conviction. He was genuine. It was a genuineness, but he had a personal touch that was just out of this world. When he asked me to go from HUD to the State Department to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, I said, you know, I've traveled internationally, but, you know, I'm not sure I'm ready for this. He said, I'm going to pair you up with Max Kappelman and Mars Abram. He said, but, you know, Ken, it's just about being the ambassador at the United Nations is like being the mayor only with interpreters. And he said, you're pretty good at interpretation because you've been interpreting Jack Kemp to me for years. And so it was that sense of humor, that personal touch. He knew that my wife, a native of West Virginia, loved country music. He loved country music, Skyline Chili, and he had and baseball. And that's, you know, there were times when he would just call and just talk baseball, which was, you know, just surprising to me, and it was disarming because the president, the most powerful man in the world, could take the time to be personal. And that translated into the way that he approached public policy and service.
Lauren, I want to go back to President Bush's success in bipartisanship and reaching across the aisle, because it is so rare, and we keep asking, will we get back there? The Washington Post writes this: he may be the last U.S. president who was not despised by a big chunk of the American public. Isn't that stunning? Some of that may have to do with the era in which Bush governed. He rose up through the Republican Party at a time when both parties were big tents consisting of liberal and conservative wings, before Americans had sorted themselves out into warring ideological camps. Can we get back there?
Well,
do we want to?
Of course we do. I do think that's a little bit of a somewhat of a rosy view of the time. I mean, let's not forget, as extraordinary as his bipartisanship was, as extraordinary as his legacy clearly is, and I feel so blessed that I got to spend time with him and Barbara, actually just a few weeks before Barbara passed away, thanks to an amazing program that he helped found called the Presidential Leadership Scholars, which he founded with his son, with President Clinton, and with the LBJ Center, focused on fostering the future civic leaders of America. It's a bipartisan organization, an extraordinary opportunity that I was privileged privilege to be another part of his legacy that hasn't been pointed to. But look, in terms of his era, I do think it's worth recalling, as extraordinary as his legacy was, the Clarence Thomas hearings were also one of the most divisive times in America. And he was willing to stick to his guns, and it was extraordinarily partisan. And he was not willing in domestic affairs, both on that and on a number of other issues. There's been a lot written in the last few days around his response, particularly during the Reagan years, to the AIDS crisis, his views on LGBT rights, which certainly evolved in his later years. But he was also part of a growing evangelical movement, and on U.S. social issues, he was quite conservative. But that said, he was a relationship person, and the great lesson of Bush 41's presidency is that his relationships were sincere, that he invested in them not because he wanted something from somebody or for cold political calculus, but because he actually was really interested in knowing them. We heard extraordinary stories about this at the Bush 41 Library in College Station this summer when we got to spend time with John Sununu and with him and many of his other staffers. That kind of sincerity of relationship building, that is the piece that is missing in Washington today that I hope we can get back to. It enables deal doing. It enables compromise in ways that I think the American people want. And so if his death inspires more Americans, more American legislators to look at that as an example, to think about how they can invest in knowing one another, to advance the good of the country ahead of their own self-interest, then he'll have left an extraordinary legacy.
He was a man of great character and dignity who didn't want a vote, any vote, irrelevant of who it was from. I remember in 1991 when David Duke was running for governor of Louisiana. I actually think we have that sound.
When someone asserts that the Holocaust never took place, then I don't believe that person ever deserves one iota of public trust. And when someone has so recently endorsed Nazism, it is inconceivable that such a person can legitimately aspire to leadership in a leadership role in a free society. And when someone has a long record, an ugly record of racism and of bigotry, that record simply cannot be erased by the glib rhetoric of a political campaign.
Peter, he went on to call David Duke a charlatan who is unfit for office. So if you can just separate the two for us, you could be a civil man, a civil leader, kinder and gentler than your typical politician, but it doesn't mean you are not strong and have very definitive views, especially when speaking about someone like David Duke.
That's exactly right. I mean, we've really turned virtue on its head in this era. When, as I said earlier, when people seem to think that bullying and bluster is a sign of strength, when in fact it's not. It's the opposite. And when you see those qualities in George H.W. Bush, he was a man of tremendous personal courage, but also a man of great decency. I want to reflect on that actually bit that you played, because I recall that at the time there were aides in the Bush 41 White House that didn't want him to weigh in on David Duke. And part of the reason is that they thought you would elevate him, that would create a backlash. But what George H.W. Bush understood was that this wasn't just a Republican moment, and it wasn't a state moment as it related to Louisiana. This was a national moment, and it required a national leader and a national voice to speak against the racism and the hate that David Duke embodied. And so he rejected the counsel of his aides to speak out, and to speak out eloquently and authentically. That was the real George H.W. Bush. And particularly in this day and age, we see how much those qualities are missed and how much they're needed.
John, you want to weigh in?
Stephanie, can I just tie into that?
Please.
Look, and he understood that there were times in American history and in world history where we couldn't hide our special lights under a bushel. And he also knew that those who would do evil loved the darkness. And that's why he was not only tender-hearted, he was tough-minded. And what's more important is that he was willing to take the risk to do the right thing. And that is a part of his leadership that is often underappreciated. He was a tough, principled leader who would take the risk to do the right thing. and he understood that, you know, at the end of the day, America would only serve the American ideal if Americans, in fact, work within that common moral framework.
Which is why he went and pushed the Americans with Disabilities Act. He brought so many people in and made them equal and made sure they had access to everything else people had access to. And I think that's a remarkable legacy, and millions of Americans don't know.
Tender-hearted and tough-minded. Ken, what a beautiful way to put it. Thank you all so much. What a conversation.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.